coming up on how to be a journalist.
So every day I'm either working with the UK team or I'm working with the world team. And I get to work on the biggest stories of the day. My biggest thing with journalism is the most important thing. I don't think print is dying. I don't think TV journalism is dying. I think we just have to really zoom in on the fact that we need to meet our audiences where they are.
Tell us about the TEDx talk.
Yeah, so October 2025, I stood on that famous red dot and basically talked for 12 or 13 minutes, probably like 12 and a half, about trauma-informed journalism.
Welcome to How to Be a Journalist, a podcast by News Associates. I'm Plamdi Mabungu, and thank you very much for tuning in. I'm a recent university graduate, and I work at News Associates. I'm early in my career, and I need the wisdom from more experienced journalists. So to solve this problem, in every episode, I will dive into conversations with some of the most dedicated and talented journalists from all corners of our industry, asking questions about their careers, successes, and giving you a different view of the person behind the byline. Whether you're an aspiring journalist, a seasoned figure in the newsroom, or just interested in knowing what happens behind the scenes, you're in the right place. Today's guest is BBC senior journalist Sophia Alexandra Hall. Sophia trained for her NCTJ with us back in 2020 before holding roles at Classic FM and Big Issue, alongside freelancing roles at Sky News as well. She also delivered a TEDx talk last year covering topics such as what makes life newsworthy and trauma-informed journalism. Amongst that, her nationally recognized trauma-informed toolkit and training resources for journalists to use when interviewing people with experience of care. But as always, enough from me. It's always better to hear from the guests themselves. So how are you doing today? Welcome to the How to Be a Journalist podcast.
I'm great, thank you so much. It's so nice to be back in this building. I think the last time I was here was 2021 and we were still under a lot of COVID restrictions.
Yeah.
So being here without a mask is really exciting. My glasses aren't fogging up, which is nice.
Yeah.
And there's no plastic screen between us.
So you just started a new job at the BBC?
I have, yes.
Tell us a little bit more.
So I now sit in the pit. So the pit is basically the people you see on screen behind the newsreaders when the BBC credits roll. Got the pips and it scans across the newsroom, and if you have a look the next time you watch it, if you look in the bottom left corner, you'll see me typing away, which is so cool. And I sit with the curation team. So I'm a senior journalist, and the curation team essentially has editorial oversight over everything digitally, specifically, articles, things on bbc.co.uk/news and bbc.com/news. So every day I'm either working with the UK team or I'm working with the world team. And I get to work on the biggest stories of the day. It is so cool. I'm only a month in, but I've talked to everyone else at the BBC and they say it does not wear off walking into Broadcasting House and going downstairs to sit in the pit.
Yeah. I saw a LinkedIn post and an Instagram post from you when you first got the new job, and you spoke about how you'd been to the Broadcasting House quite some time earlier. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
For sure, yeah. I've been lucky enough to have been to the BBC a couple of times, but around 10 years ago, in fact, exactly 10 years ago this June, I got what the BBC calls work experience. I think anywhere else would call it an internship or something. I got BBC work experience to work on the BBC proms. So this was during my first year at university. I was studying music very roguely. I'm good at music. That's why I was studying it. And BBC TV had an opportunity to come just spend like 3 weeks basically being a runner on the BBC proms. So you'd get to work across the TV broadcast and also very much do some running around the Royal Albert Hall. I thought, this is so cool, this is so great. And I got this opportunity, and I actually got my first ever TV credit from it, because out of all the work experience people, they chose 6 people to work on the last night of the proms. And I got to work on the last night of the proms, and that was my first ever TV credit, 2016. It says runners, and I think I'm like the second person. I remember being so proud, and I thought, this is amazing. I'm going to graduate university and immediately start working at the BBC. Took 10 years to actually get a job. I will say I applied multiple times to work at the BBC. I think it's one of those places you look at as a journalist and you're like, wow, yeah. When you're a kid, everyone knows BBC News, I applied maybe 5 times, never got an interview over the last 10 years. And it got to this point in my career where I was just like, well, it's more about, if I fit the role, if I want the role, if the role fits me, all of this. And I went in with such an open mind. I was absolutely shocked when I got invited for an interview. But turns out an interview is all I needed.
No, clearly so, clearly so. And it seems like you've entered the job at a very, very pivotal time in UK politics. Just the news cycle has not been slow by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
So can you tell us a little bit about the current articles or the current stories that you've had to cover in these month and a bit?
Absolutely, yeah. When I arrived, that was the week that Artemis was coming back to Earth and landing. And so a lot of our page was just pictures of the moon and astronauts and pictures of Earth. It was incredible. But at the same time, you had things like the Iran war going on, which has been really hard to cover. I mean, all wars are hard to cover, but this is my first time working in such an international newsroom. We often see things that maybe a journalist working at a smaller organisation wouldn't, and especially in my new role where I have a bit more editorial oversight. It's a lot reading all those articles every day, but at the same time, you also get to, read about man taking, going the furthest they've ever been, which is very cool. Obviously, in the last few weeks, politics has also ramped up. And I've felt quite lucky because the last few days I've been on the world desk. So I haven't had to deal with every single political article coming through, but it's also international news in a lot of way. Who knows by the time this podcast comes out, what's going to be happening. So I can't guess or say anything either way. But it's changing all the time. And I actually ended up going to a wedding this weekend, which was really fun, but this was the first time I've shut off from the news recently. And that was really tricky, then coming back into the newsroom and having to make sure I was up to date enough to step back in. But also it was really good for my mental health, I think, to step away this weekend and go celebrate my friends and not think about Keir Starmer for 2 days.
Yeah. I guess when you're talking about Iran, for example, and you are needing to shut off from work to, promote a nice work-life balance, you could say, how do you, cover those difficult stories and, make sure that it doesn't, burn away at you?
I've done a lot of work in trauma-informed journalism, and it's really funny because I've found myself applying the same techniques that I talk about, in my TED Talk and in my toolkit to myself recently. It's very much like I need to understand that the preacher actually has some good points. Something I've never done previously before, but I find myself, we have a very mandatory hour break in the middle of our day. We work really long days at the BBC, they're 10-hour shifts. And when I used to work at The Big Issue, I'd always work at my desk, over lunch, I'd eat, I'd keep writing or researching or doing socials, whatever. With the BBC, I walk upstairs, I eat my lunch in a completely different place. I don't eat it in the newsroom, and I watch The Simpsons. I just watch something that I know is not going to be talking about politics, is not going to be talking about war, and just completely turn my brain off for that hour. I've never done that in any other job, but it's so needed. It's so needed. And that then allows me to do things like listen to news podcasts on the way into work, listen to news podcasts on the way out of work, and not feel like I'm completely burning out because I have had that break in the middle. And then obviously when I get home, I can, completely switch off if possible. I would say, I'd go home and I'd watch some TV or I'd do this. Often I'm just a bit too tired to do any of that. So I kind of have my end of day routine in the middle of my day instead. So my role basically has me thinking in the mind of a BBC viewer or someone coming to the website, one of the 16 million people who do every day. And so I have to think, if I'm met with 7 articles right at the start, all about Iran, how is that going to make me feel? Yes, maybe informed, but also probably a bit overwhelmed. We can probably have 7 articles about Iran on the homepage, but I wouldn't put them all at the top. We might have something about UK politics, but we also might have something about a cuddly panda bear in China. As an example, yesterday I had a story quite low about this monkey called Punch. And one of the assistant editors was like, no, bring it up. People want to see a monkey. And she was right. People do sometimes need a break, even on BBC News. seeing something else like that. And sometimes there are good news stories that don't always present in a good news way. So maybe it's a breakthrough in scientific healthcare for women. Cool. Like, it might not be the biggest story that day, but for some people it might be the biggest story that day. There are 3 kind of underserved audiences we look at the BBC, and that's ages 16 to 24. It's women and it's working families. And so that could be, people who come from my kind of background, like people who grew up in care. Maybe it's people from certain northern towns. Maybe it's people who, both parents are working. And I try and get in their head as well. And we have all sorts of very, very fancy like analytics to work out what different people need and want. But also I feel like I come from such a diverse background that I also have an inkling into what certain kinds of people want. I've always seen myself as a bit of a chameleon because, yes, like I now work at BBC News, which is so cool. And I went to Oxford, but I also, I was in foster care as a teenager. I have friends from so many different backgrounds in terms of, politics as well. We had this introduction at the BBC where they said, oh, do all your friends think and feel the same way? We're all caught in our little bubble. And I was like, actually not. Because I realised a couple of years ago, I think it was the 2019 election, how much of a bubble social media was. And after that, I've made so much more of a conscious effort to try and make connections, find friends who have completely different viewpoints to me. Because at the end of the day, the BBC audience isn't serving one person, it's trying to serve the whole country.
So when you're working in social sort of roles and you're working for a company like the BBC or a Big Issue or Classic FM, and there is this echo chamber that you're only hearing the thoughts and opinions of people that agree with you, how do you try and make sure that the reach of your content is going out to the widest amount of people? So what is your thought process in doing that?
I know for a platform like the BBC, it's a little bit easier just because they have so many followers and they're able to reach such a wide audience. With a platform like Big Issue, I don't think we ever got more than 60,000 followers when I was there, which, fair enough. It's not about inspiring debate necessarily, but it's about writing a post or making a video in a way that people want to comment on it and tell them their views as well.
Yeah.
Because yes, we're the news, but we don't have our comment sections closed. A lot of the pieces we were writing at the Big Issue anyway, a lot of the stuff we wrote about really affects everyday people, and people do have a view on it because they are experts in their own lives. So maybe a trip to the moon, people might not have a ton of opinions on it about how it affects them personally, but in terms of rent prices or waiting lists on the NHS, people are going to have opinions. And so we let people get out of the echo chamber by writing and expressing their own feelings. When I was at the Big Issue, I edited the letters page for however long I was there, nearly 3 years. And I would read every single letter that came in, every single email, every single comment, every letter that got posted in. And in a way, as much as sometimes it was tedious to do, when I compiled that letters page, it was also one of the best parts about the job because I got to see such a wide range of views. And, Big Issue could be construed as you're helping homeless people, you must be left-leaning. The large majority of our audience was right-leaning because think about who can contribute £5 a week for a magazine. And so that was a really interesting way to see all these different political opinions from across the country.
Yeah. And I guess when you're trying to reach the 16 to 24 age demographic, why have the BBC or any of the places that you've worked struggled with doing that? Because I know for a fact quite a lot of the listeners are around that 16 to 24 age range.
For sure. I know you had Eleanor on
Yeah.
and she works for Newsbeat, and Newsbeat very specifically targets that segment of audience. I think my biggest thing with journalism is the most important thing. I don't think print is dying. I don't think TV journalism is dying. I think we just have to really zoom in on the fact that we need to meet our audiences where they are. Sometimes that is social media. Sometimes it's a Reddit thread. Sometimes it's TikTok. Sometimes it is TV, but it's clipped up. Sometimes it's print but put into a book. You know, a lot of these kind of older genres of literature and things are coming back in. I know with TikTok, I was kind of in charge of it at Classic and also at Big Issue. So much of my strategy was just trial and error. And I think that's always going to happen with new technology. I think we're still trying to figure out things, you know, with AI. We're still trying to understand how journalists can use it in an ethical way that doesn't impact on what we're saying, but can also hopefully draw more audiences in. How we use social media, you know, there are some platforms that have actually absolutely spiked over the last few years. I think about Simple Politics being a great platform, Joe Politic, like a lot of different places that I know have engaged that 16 to 24 bracket. And I think the BBC can continue to do it. I mean, you look at some of the stories we tell, like we even just one about like Shakira's tax refund yesterday. And Newsbeat do such a great job with that as well. I was looking at the stats the other day, and the biggest percentage of young people we had on any article that week was the Political Live page. Young people are really engaged with politics. And a lot of my colleagues were like, oh, that's so crazy. And I was like, no, it's not. People want to get control of their lives. People want to understand what's happening.
So now I kind of want to segue and bring it back. So you spoke about Oxford a little bit and also about music. So tell me about your time at Oxford, and when did you make that decision that you were going to make a pivot into journalism? When was that first moment? Where did that come from?
I never wanted to be a journalist. I didn't think it was for someone like me. I didn't think I was good enough at writing. I love music. I have played the saxophone for 22 years. It's my everything. It got me through some really rough times in my childhood. And I remember during my A-levels, like my history teacher predicted me a D. Like I'd gone into foster care. It was a really rough time, but the thing that kept me going was sax and playing music. And I went to a specialist music school. And I realised when I was doing my A-levels that I didn't want to then go on to music conservatoire and just study saxophone for another 4 years, because I felt like I'd done that already. I thought, okay, I want to go to a university, and, you know, I really back myself. Come on, let's apply for Oxford, and why don't you apply for Harvard in case you don't get in? Such an egotistical kid. No, it was one of those where I had so many, like, you know, my social workers when I got my offer from Oxford said, "Oh, you mean Oxford Brookes, right?" I had so many people just saying, like, "You can't do this," and I'm the type of person that if someone tells me that, I'm like, "All right, let's try, let's go." So I went to Oxford to do music, and it was so much fun. I got to play sax basically all the time, had nothing to do with my degree. Music degree at Oxford is basically history in disguise. Just really focused on composers. And so I played sax at loads of balls, at loads of parties. Yeah, great time. But the one thing that was missing is I didn't tell anyone I was care experienced. So care experience means you either grew up in foster care or residential care, or you were adopted, or kinship care. And I'd been in foster care, and for some reason I just thought there was going to be this massive bias, and so I didn't say anything until my third year. I got made president of the Oxford University Jazz Orchestra, and I was meant to do this talk about how I was the first woman to hold that position. Super cool, wow, feminism. And I completely hijacked the talk to instead talk about the fact that I was care experienced, and I called myself the real-life Tracy Beaker. Oh, it's so cringe. So I always kind of felt a bit like an outsider, and when I came out, air quotes, as a care experienced person, I was shocked by how many people just didn't care, and I hadn't been expecting that. I did later get some pushback from a couple of sort of more well-off kids, and got a bit of like anonymous bullying and things, which was really rough, and something I hadn't expected because we were all like 20, 21.
Yeah.
And so I graduated Oxford. I wasn't entirely sure what to do, but I loved music, so I thought, I guess the only option if I don't want to be a music teacher is to go into the music business. So I went to business school, and that put me in a lot of debt. Like, the master's degree at business school was not my best idea, but when I was doing it, I worked 3 different jobs to try and help me pay the fees to get through it, and one of those was a presenter on Jazz London Radio. And it was so funny because I'd talk about current affairs and stuff and still didn't clock I wanted to be a journalist. If you read my undergraduate dissertation, it reads like a 10,000 word article. It is so funny that I didn't realise I wanted to be a journalist.
Yeah.
For reference, my dissertation was about Pussy Riot, who are a band. Do you know Pussy Riot?
No, I
Cool.
don't.
So in 2012, they performed what some people would call anti-Putin music, and they were arrested and imprisoned for 2 years. Once they were let out in 2016, they then performed what some would say was an anti-Trump anthem. And I basically analysed both songs and said, did this affect the upcoming president's election, like in the next, because both of the songs were released 8 days before the subsequent 2012 Russian presidential election and 2016 American presidential election. Yeah. Which, that's a feature, right? It does kind of read like that. So I was happily, in the music industry, 2019, 2020. We all know what happened in 2020. COVID shut down the music industry. I was sat in my bedroom with a saxophone, like, oh no, what do I do? I was put on rotational furlough. I was working in a concert hall at the time. And in April 2020, the government brought in a statutory instrument called SI 445. This basically came in overnight and it removed a ton of rights from kids in foster care. And I was growing a bit of a social media following at the time, and I thought, this is terrible. Why is no one talking about this? And it was all this, complex legal jargon, and a lot of my community were like, what's going on? We don't get it. No one's explaining it. And so I contacted an organisation called Article 39, who were taking the Department for Education to High Court to try and reverse the decision. And I said, hi, I'm available. I'm in my bedroom with a saxophone. Can I do anything? I don't have a legal background, but I know how to read really inaccessible stuff and turn it into, more accessible stuff. And so they said, go through all these Ofsted reports, try and find us some evidence. And I was like, yeah, sure, cool. So I was going through these Ofsted reports, but everything I was finding out, I would then try and type into, 150 characters or whatever it was on Twitter at the time and explain to my community what was going on. And while I was doing this, I thought, do I want to be a lawyer? Do I want to become a lawyer? And I realized, no, you're taking inaccessible language and turning it into, this shorthand communication. I think this is journalism. So I decided to apply for here, News Associates, and also law school. And I said, whichever one I get full funding to go do, I'll go do. And I got the Journalism Diversity Fund to come here, and the rest is history.
And then I guess tell us about tell us about your journalism training, and did you enjoy that? Did you enjoy that period of time in your life?
Yeah, I remember we saw Lucy downstairs, and she did my interview over Zoom because everything was over Zoom at the time because of COVID. And I'm pretty sure I said to her in the interview, I was like, I don't want to be a journalist. I just really want some good communication, training. I was like, yeah, it's really going to help with my activism, really going to help being, a care experience person. And for some reason, she let me in. I didn't have a single article to my name, apart from one opinion piece I'd done at university about being care experienced. Anyway, I arrived, I thought I wasn't good enough at writing, and the tutors here were great. I remember one of my first lessons was basically one of the Grahams saying to all of us, just tear up everything you know about writing, essentially. I'm going to reteach you how to write. And I was like, don't be ridiculous. I went to Oxford. I know how to write. I did not know how to write at all. He was like, you need to write an article in 10 words. I was like, that's not possible. You need to write an article in, 50 words. You need to write an article in 100 words. And that kind of training, that is honestly the best education I think I've ever gotten. I really back myself as a writer now because of how much my writing was taken apart here. And it's funny, I was never actually taught how to write an article here. I was just taught all the building blocks.
And then I guess after that point, Classic FM?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about that role.
It kind of made sense. I saw the job come up and it said content editor. And I was like, great, I could be an editor straight out of journalism school. And I listened to Classic FM a bit when I was younger because I went to music school. I trained as a musician. A lot of the training starts in classical music. And it just looked like the dream role for me. I was like, I can be a journalist working in classical music. Surely, like, I'm going to get this job. And I went for it and I did get the job. And it taught me so much I wasn't expecting. It taught me how to be really great at TikTok. I grew a TikTok account from 2,000 followers to 300,000 in 18 months. It taught me how to make a good promo image. You just need to keep doing it. Like, I don't even know how to describe it. When you see an article, there's obviously an image at the top. Even just the slightest change can encourage maybe 100,000 more people to click on that image. And I feel like I have the eye now. It was my first time in a national radio station, which was really, really cool. But Classic taught me a lot of things, and I was writing every day. I didn't do as much as some of my friends who were working, at the Express or My London, where they were writing 6+ articles a day. But I was writing 3, and even just having that, just every single day, 3 articles. It just trained me so well for what was to come.
What do you think about the importance of accepting these new platforms? Because you seem to have done it quite consistently across your career.
My mantra is meeting the audience where they are, and if our audience is on TikTok, or if an audience we haven't reached yet is on TikTok, of course I'm going to try everything to get there. I think there was a point you made earlier when you said, how do we reach this 16 to 24-year-old audience? By getting 16 to 24-year-olds in the room. When I was at Classic, I was 24. I was a TikTok native. I was on it all the time. That is how we were able to grow it so fast, because I knew what the trends were. I knew what was happening. And it's the same, whatever platform you're on. If you're on Instagram and you know what the trends are, likely thing is you're going to go more viral than if you're just posting a basic caption and photo, And
then, I guess Big Issue was a big period of your life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you spent, 3 years there?
Yeah, almost 3 years. I loved Big Issue so much. It was the dream, role. I couldn't believe it when I saw, technically my job didn't exist. So it was summer 2023, and I really enjoyed Classic, but I really wanted to get back into mainstream news. And I have always been a social affairs journo at heart. A lot of the big, first investigations I did were all around foster care, mental health, asylum seekers, climate crisis, not really social affairs, but bordering. The people it affects is. And I knew I wanted to be a social affairs journalist, but no one hires social affairs reporters. No one's putting an advert out for social affairs correspondent. And so I saw the Big Issue and I thought, well, that's just a social affairs paper. Everything they do has a connection to social affairs. And they were hiring a digital editor. And I looked at this job description and I was like, that's me in 10 years. That is not me now. And so I was like, you know what, Sophia, just go for it. The best thing you could hope for is maybe they'll reach out to you in a year and say they need an arts reporter or something. Yeah. And I wrote the longest application. Yeah. But they asked for a growth strategy. And I wrote what then turned into a social growth strategy at Big Issue. And I got an interview. And I had a very fun interview. And after that interview, I got an email and they said, hey, you're really cool, you're really impressive, but we're not going to give you the job. And then the next line was, however, we would like to make you deputy digital editor. Nice. And so they basically just created this new role, which was so cool. Yeah.
And what were the biggest things that you learned during that new role?
I learned so much at Big Issue. Firstly, just a massive shout out to my team, Greg Barradale, who's also ex-News Associates, Isabella McRae, Lottie Elton, Ryan Butcher, Adrian Lobb. They are all coming to my wedding in September. That's how close we all are. And also, I got to work really closely with PRs, which is something I hadn't really done because Classic FM is part of Global. Global is a huge organisation. PRs would sit on a completely different floor. However, I would be sat next to James and Ruth every single day, who are the PRs, Big Issue. And working with them, the kind of caliber of celebrities we got to work for as well. People would always say, everyone wants to be on the cover of Big Issue because it looks like you're doing something really good, you know? Yeah. I learned about print journalism. Getting to see your first article in print is really cool when you're a freelancer. When you're at an organization that you love, and seeing your name inside the magazine every single week, it's, really, really emotive. And then Changemakers was awesome. So every year since about 2019, the Big Issue has come up with this list of 100 people and organisations across the UK changing, Britain for the better. And I got to, for 3 years, running, completely edit that magazine and basically help choose that top 100. And you could have been having like the roughest week. The news cycle could have been so horrific. And you read a bio of one of these people and it just absolutely restores your faith in humanity. Like I'm going to blank on like every single person now. But, we had people as young as 12 raising money for people experiencing homelessness. I think our oldest was a 90-year-old skydiver. Again, raising money. You have organisations that train people with lived experience on how to be spokespeople. You have people giving out free meals to asylum seekers. You have people supporting the trans community, just all these incredible, incredible people. I got to write about them and go meet them.
Yeah. And how was it like working for a publication that aligns with your beliefs?
Oh, just so fulfilling. Like, so many people talk about the dream job, but this was really, just felt so fulfilled. And I think it really helps as well, where that job could have been so much worse if I hadn't had the team I had. Colleagues really do sometimes make your experience in a workplace, and I've never had an experience like that where colleagues felt like friends.
Tell us about the TEDx talk.
Yeah, so October 2025, I stood on that famous red dot and basically talked for 12 or 13 minutes, probably like 12 and a half, about trauma-informed journalism. And so TEDx talks kind of very famously, they kind of want you to get in your personal experience. And when I first started working on this TEDx talk, it wasn't going to have anything to do with me. But I've realised just how much my care experience is connected to my career as a journalist. It as you've heard, it is the reason I got into journalism. And I do think that empathy I developed when I was younger has been so helpful for securing interviews and helping people, trust me, to share and feel like they can share their story with me. And so in the talk, I spoke about the first time I was ever in the media. It wasn't on the byline. It was an article about me. And so I have very much, not figuratively, but literally sat on both sides of the table as a journalist. I've been both the interviewer and the interviewee, which I think is so important. I feel like every journalist should have that happen to them because it's a vulnerable position to be in. It's like what I'm doing with you now. You're the one in control. You're the one asking questions. Yeah.
I guess as well, how important do you see the human side of storytelling, and actually how important is that to you?
So important, so important. It's funny, I call myself a social affairs journalist, but I think social affairs is kind of a rubbish title. Social affairs is stories about humans, and every story is about humans, right?
Yeah.
I find the human side of every story. Like between Big Issue and BBC, I set up a little series on my Instagram and TikTok called Zooming In, where I looked at the global headlines and kind of zoomed in on those unheard human stories. Like, for example, at the start of the year, everyone was looking at Greenland because of President Trump's writings on social media. Everyone was looking at Greenland, and everyone was looking at it from like a military strategic point of view. And I thought, well, what about the people living there? I had to zoom in, and turns out if the latest homelessness count is what researchers have estimated it to be, Greenland has the highest homelessness rate in the Western world. So about 2% of its population is thought to be homeless. And that's insane when you think about it, considering rough sleeping is fatal in Greenland because it's too cold. You can't sleep outside. Yeah. And so it's finding those sorts of stories where, I think people are still interested in them. They're just not as talked about as big guns on Snowy Island, you know.
Yeah, no, of course. So you also spent quite a lot of time in the United States as well, a decent amount of time. I don't want to give too much away, so I'll let you do the talking. Tell me about it.
I've been to the States a couple of times. I got quite lucky. The first time I went for work was 2022 when the Journalism Diversity Fund worked with the US Embassy, and they sent 5 journalists from across the UK to go on a reporting tour of the States. And I got to go to the White House, got to be in the press briefing room.
Cool.
It was so cool. Met the press secretary, met the defense press secretary. Again, 2022, a different administration to what we have now. We went to Minneapolis. We went to the street where George Floyd was murdered. We went to Arizona during June, so it was absolutely boiling, like 44 degrees upwards. And that taught me so much because I went for 10 days and I came back with 10 articles because I couldn't stop writing. I mean, when are you going to get that opportunity again? It was awesome. And then in 2024, I did a Churchill Fellowship, and I went to Boston, New York, and Los Angeles, and that was all to research for my toolkit, which you so kindly mentioned at the start, called Media Toolkit for Journalists and Care Experienced People. And that's a physical document, it's also online, teaching journalists how to work with interviewees from a care experienced background, but also care experienced interviewees how to work with journalists.
Mm-hmm. And I guess as well, like, that toolkit is found in national and local papers across the country because it is so good. So you did, if I remember correctly, it is 50 interviews in the United States in 29 days.
Yeah.
So tell me about that insane output.
I think it was, to be fair, it might have been 30 days, but 30 days. I'll give you the extra day. It was a lot. I do not recommend it for anyone. And again, the tips I then went on to write in that toolkit, I really should have taken myself. I should have given myself more time off. As much as I talk about it, I don't think we should put that kind of like intense grind on such a pedestal. I came back and I was meant to kind of write this up in the next 3 months. It took me maybe 6, 7 instead. Insane. For those of you not watching, I'm sure you knew what I just did. It took about 7 months. And it took that long because I was so burnt out, and I didn't realize how intense those interviews were going to feel for me. So I went into this, obviously someone with lived experience and personal experience of the care system, but so many people out there just saw me as a journalist, which I am, but at the end of the day I am both. And I remember, I've told the story a few times, I walked into a newsroom and it was about 9 a.m. and it was there were great journalists there, and the first person I spoke to was this incredible journalist, and I have so much respect for her. But it was 9 a.m. and she sat me down and talked to me about one of the worst cases of SA I'd ever heard, because it was a story she'd written about. And I just remember sitting there like, oh, my brain can't process this. It's so early. I've never met you before. And wow, this is really rough. I wasn't ready for it, you know? And ever since then, it was such a good learning, for sure. And it was also such a good reminder as someone who is also a journalist, that when you're speaking to someone who maybe in that sense was kind of interviewer-interviewee perspective, you got to think about the other person and if they've heard something like that before. Yeah. And I think about that all the time, you know, when I post on my social media, even I'm someone who will put like a news trigger warning before a story. Yeah. I'm someone who will warn people or put stuff in close friends or something if I think it might have an impact on someone. And I apply the same rules when I'm writing an article.
Yeah. And okay, we've also brought up trauma-informed a couple of times, but I think it's really important to get a definition out there as well, just for ease. So, like, what is the definition of trauma-informed reporting?
Absolutely. For me, trauma-informed reporting is... I have, like, a very official definition in my toolkit, but I'd say for anyone who is a reporter and wants to make sure they're trauma-informed, it is about thinking about the other person and putting yourself in their shoes. We throw around the word trauma-informed quite a lot in a lot of different sectors, but it is also having a sense of what could go wrong, which is a bit bleak. But when you're interviewing people who might be vulnerable interviewees, or maybe just this is the first time they've ever told their story, you need to think how you can help if something goes differently. Something I heard when I was in New York at the Dart Center, which is this amazing hub of trauma-informed journalism specialism at Columbia, was journalists are often first responders. And that's because sometimes you're the first person they've ever told this story to. You're the first person that they've seen. Maybe, you know, when journalists are working abroad, you know, in foreign war zones and stuff, they could be the first people on the scene. Yeah. And now I'm not saying, you know, you need to be a social worker, you need to be a counsellor, whatever. You just need to know, you know, what to look out for. And so some of the tips I talk about in my toolkit is if people maybe stop looking you in the eye, if they're looking around, if there's pauses, if they're, you know, not really speaking, if they get quieter. And so I have some tips about how to pull people out of that, like saying, oh, it's a bit cold in here, right? You know, getting people to feel what's going on around them, bring them back into their bodies. Oh, what time does it say on the clock over there? Can you read that? You've got their eyes looking at the clock now. Yeah. And it's also about recognizing the power dynamics you have as a journalist. So when I came in here, for example, and I'm going to call you out, I think you are trauma-informed for the record, but I am going to call you out. There was already stuff set up where you're sitting, and so I knew this was the only place for me to sit. When I'm interviewing someone, I try and give some of the power back. So if we walk into a room, I say, do you want to sit there or do you want to sit there? Like, where do you want to sit? And it's about giving some kind of power. Even if you can't tell them, like, these are all the questions I'm going to ask you, you can ask me questions. You can still give them power in those sorts of ways. Yeah. You know, you asked me earlier what I wanted to drink. That was really nice. That's a kind of, you know, letting go of the power sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay, that is fascinating, actually, as well. That's so good, so good. So then now I kind of want to go into about your proudest moments of your career so far.
Something that really stands out for me, it's technically before I became a journalist, but I was doing journalist type things. So for a while I worked with the Children's Commissioner's Office, and they created the first ever online platform for care experienced people. And as part of that, I'd write articles. Which is so funny, again, how did I not know I wanted to be a journalist? And due to that work, I was invited to the Queen's Garden Party in 2019. And I'd say that was probably my proudest moment, and not because I was in Buckingham Palace, but because I could not afford food at that time. I was using an app called Olio to like get stale bread because I couldn't afford like real food. I was like living in period poverty. I had a £20 dress from TK Maxx, and I felt so out of place. I didn't have anyone to bring, so I brought someone who was on my master's course, who I literally haven't spoken to since. It was so funny. Everyone was lining up to meet. It was Prince Charles at the time, and I was away in the sandwich tent, just eating as many sandwiches as possible. It was because I hadn't eaten in a few days, and it was that real like dichotomy and juxtaposition of, you know, you've done so well, Sophia, you've escaped the care system, you know, you've gone on to have this successful career, and actually, you know, I was living in such abject poverty. But then here I was at Buckingham Palace, and I think that was the first time I was like, I think you can make it, Soph. I think things are going to get better, and they did, and they have just kept getting better. And I wish 16-year-old Sophia knew what was coming, because yeah, I never could have imagined this life for me. I'm working at BBC News, and I'm getting married in September. It's everything I could have ever dreamed of.
So my next question that I want to ask you, I want to segue back into, well, you have a big focus on covering underrepresented communities. Mm-hmm. So how important do you think is it for people that are diverse? I tap the table quite a lot. It's like I'm playing piano. How important is it for you that people from diverse backgrounds cover stories on their communities?
Yeah, this is a conundrum, isn't it? Because I want as much diversity in the newsroom as possible, but I don't want to then pigeonhole people from certain communities to only cover their communities. I describe myself as a care experience journalist, but that's not because I'm a journalist who covers care experience. It's just because that's the community I'm from. I have made a very specific point about not having my beat just be about care experience. I think that's so important. However, I have kind of made it my brand to encourage people from similar backgrounds as me into journalism. I worked with the John Schofield Trust a few years ago to launch a pilot for aspiring journalists from a care experience or adopted background. I also developed a toolkit very specifically so people would stop coming to me for advice. No, like obviously I'm happy to give advice, but I would much rather a journalist who is covering the care experience community for the first time, they can go away and just read and understand. And so I'd rather there be tools in place for journalists. I think it's really important for journalists across the industry to be able to cover this community, not because they've lived in it, but because they understand it. Obviously, sometimes it doesn't matter what you do. You might have 30 minutes before you're dropped into a community and you have to go cover them. That's fine. But I'd love to return to the newsroom and have someone else in the newsroom maybe know a bit more than me and then talk to them about it. Also, I think it's so important that when you are covering communities that have been historically underrepresented in the media or underreported on, that you focus their voices. Something I always used to say to reporters that the big issue is if you feel like you don't know this community well enough, can you get them to write an op-ed? Can you make their voices the main thing? We don't always have to be the ones telling the story. Sometimes it's kind of not our right.
Yeah.
Sometimes I would much rather hear it from the people who have experienced it firsthand. And if it is you telling the story, obviously be respectful, understand, that there is a long history of this community you might not understand, but maybe you have a journalist friend you can talk to about it. So I do think diversity in the media can be achieved without pigeonholing each, diverse journalist into just one beat.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of an episode that I recorded back in October with Hannah Rajala, who is the founder of We Are Black Journalists. Yeah. And she spoke very much the same sort of thing, where she was saying, like, she doesn't want black journalists to be stuck covering Stormzy, like, every single week or so, but it has to be a mix. Let's say, for example, even Jordan Jack Bryan's episode as well, he said that diversity is required in the media, but himself as a journalist, he said, being black is the least interesting part about him. There's so much more that he brings to the table. It's not just his race, because that's a factor that he can't necessarily control. Yeah. So I always find that to be an interesting question to always ask. So now I want to segue into the game. So the game is called Headline or Hidden Story. So I'm going to give you a generic topic or scenario, and you have to tell me what angle you would focus on. Okay. So let's say you have a story about a vulnerable interviewee. So a vulnerable interviewee that is from a care experience background. Sure. What is your first thought as a journalist to get that story and cover it with justice?
I mean, if you're saying, like, you're using the phrase vulnerable interviewee, I first need to make sure that this person understands what talking to a journalist is all about. I have a list in my toolkit, which is 10 questions to ask yourself before talking to a journalist. I want to make sure they're doing an interview for the right reason, like who's put up this interview. Is it a charity? Have they come to me themselves and trusted me? Is it through an organization? Like, how have I met this interviewee? Are they the main story, or is it a wider general news story that they just happen to be a quote-unquote case study in? Regardless, I want to put them first and make sure that their well-being is okay, specifically if we're talking about them as a vulnerable interviewee.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. And then, okay, scenario number 2. You have been commissioned to make a BBC documentary, and this documentary is going to be about those that are from diverse backgrounds in Tower Hamlets. Okay. How would you start by doing that?
I would go to Tower Hamlets. I think most importantly, embed yourself in a community. If I am going to be fronting it, I don't necessarily think I should have the majority of time on screen. I should be speaking to the people who are actually there, who can tell me firsthand what's happened. If we're going to go like really deep into it, I'd start infiltrating various like social media groups and try and find out, but also use my own network, my own contacts, like find friends of friends. You know, I'm a Southeast London girl, like I'm sure I can go north of the river, it'll be fine. But yeah, exactly. Embed yourself in the community, find those stories firsthand. Sure, you can speak to MPs, local councillors, whatever, but I want to be knocking on doors. I want to go to a local community centre. I want to find out what the story is at their level.
Yeah, no, of course. And when you're like covering stories like that, what do you think are the biggest myths that you'd like to dispel about covering those sorts of communities? I'm just really intrigued about this one. This is a question of mine, actually.
We used to do some really cool social posts, Big Issue, where we take sort of the big myths of the day and debunk them. I'm not, in terms of myths around actually covering, I think with a lot of communities who have often been underreported or underrepresented in the media, there is a general distrust. And so I really try and work with them hand in hand. There are certain things I do with communities, like people, you know, from asylum-seeking backgrounds, that I wouldn't do with, say, a politician. So I might give them more of an idea of the questions I'm going to ask. I might give them not quote approval, but quote oversight. Sometimes when you're talking, I think we've both done it on this podcast, you might say something that you're later like, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. And now imagine telling like the worst thing that ever happened to you to a complete stranger.
Yeah.
You might get quite emotional, or you might start to trust that person and say something that you might regret later. And that could be, you know, a blip for a journalist, but that could haunt you for the rest of your life as an interviewee. So having those kind of barriers and boundaries in place, I'd say, is something that's quite good to have as a journalist. I don't think it's necessarily like a misconception, but it's something, or a myth, but I want people to think about it when they are speaking to these communities. At the end of the day, this is just your story. This is their whole life, and you have to remember that power, that imbalance.
Yeah, no, most definitely. Thank you very much for answering those questions. I feel like I've heard a significant amount about your career and, well, very much in detail. And you are very much like, yeah, rock star.
Thanks, mate. You too.
And with that, it's time for the questions that usually trip people up. The most difficult ones. And I've asked a lot of questions today. But now I'd like to enter the fast and furious round. Number one is, and this is the one that I find to be one of the most important ones, because people think you have to be a certain type of person to be a journalist. Are you an extrovert or are you an introvert, Sophia?
What do you think?
I would probably guess extrovert.
Cool.
But I may be wrong.
You know, I love talking to people, but the more time I've been in this, I've talked a lot about my fiancé, but I have a fiancé, I'm getting married. And since being with him, I do just love hanging out on the sofa.
Yeah, because I guess it depends on like people that give you energy, and
exactly,
people that take it away from you, and
absolutely.
He clearly gives you energy.
He does.
Night owl or early riser?
Now, if you'd asked me this before starting at the BBC, would have said now night owl all the way, every day. These days I'm an early riser. I'm up at 4 and I love it. And I love it. It's really strange. It's really strange. I've never had it before. I will say I am able to get a cab that early in the morning though, and I do think that changes it, because I find myself less tired when I've gotten a cab in for a 6 a.m. start than when I've gotten the train in for an 8 a.m. start. Yeah. I think it's that luxury.
Dream interview if you haven't interviewed them already.
So my dream interview is always someone who has historically completely distrusted the media and has found strength and trust in telling their story to me. I'd say that is my dream interviewee. If you absolutely forced me to give a person, I'd say Nadia Tolokonnikova, who was the founding member of Pussy Riot, who I did write about in my dissertation. I think she would be absolutely fascinating to interview.
And let's say you had the opportunity to interview her right after this, so you're leaving the NA building, you're going to interview Nadia. What would you do to prepare yourself for the interview?
It'd be nothing but like blasting Pussy Riot in my ears. What I would definitely have that in my ears, but in reality, I'd be reading other recent interviews she'd done to try and make sure I'm not asking questions she's heard a million times before. My favourite thing when you're interviewing someone who's either pretty famous or has done a lot of interviews is asking a question they've never heard before. That's when I think I've had a successful interview, you know.
Yeah, and outside of Pussy Riot, if you had the opportunity to listen to any song, basically, what would be your main interview psych-up song? Even like,
What's your interview psych-up song?
so at the moment, it's a Brazilian song called Amiga da Minha Mulher, just like a samba rock sort of song. Like immediately, I was walking into the office and I did have a little bit of a bop, and it was like 7:45.
If I had to choose, it's that song. I'm a bitch. I'm a boss. I'm a bitch. And a boss and a shine like glass.
Favorite concert you've ever been to?
Okay, so in 2017, I was at a Love Supreme festival. Great festival. I was there with like my entire jazz band from uni. And we'd see some really cool artists all day. And then me and my friend earlier in the day, we'd had like a bit of a fight. And everyone was like, oh, Gregory Porter is going to be on stage. And I'd never heard this guy sing before. And I was like, yeah, whatever, fine. We were at the back of this gigantic field. And Gregory Porter, who is just has the most chocolate melty voice, actually I don't like chocolate, the most fondue melty voice in the world, standing on stage, and he sang this song called Don't Be a Fool. And by the end of the song, my mate and I were like hugging and crying, and it was just such a transcendent experience. It was one of those where like it was like twilight and all the lights of like people's phones and the stage were it was so magical, and I think about that song all the time. I think about that performance all the time.
Gregory Porter.
Gregory Porter, yeah.
Noted.
Yeah, we'll play it after this.
Yeah. And then, okay, TV show you're currently watching?
The Boys.
The Boys.
Love The
Enjoying
Boys.
it?
Oh my God, so much. I'm so sad it's ending. I'm so sad it's ending.
Last question is one word to describe your career as of right now.
Purposeful.
Purposeful. Well, and with that, thank you very much for coming onto the How to Be a Journalist podcast. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and we will be listening to Gregory Porter as soon as the cameras are turned off.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. I've been Plamini Mabungu, signing off.